My name is Nick, and I thought I had found the perfect home when I moved into the house at the end of Riverbend Road. I had been searching for months, scrolling through endless listings, going to open houses and meeting with realtors. Most of the places I saw were either too expensive or felt too cramped, but when I stumbled upon the house, it was different. It sat on a quiet street, surrounded by tall trees that formed a natural barrier from the rest of the world. The property had a large yard, a detached garage, and a long gravel driveway that crunched under your feet when you walked on it. The house itself was 2 stories tall, with faded white paint and black shutters that needed some work. It had a certain charm, though, like it had been waiting for someone to give it life again. I wasn't sure why it had been on the market for so long. The price was suspiciously low considering how much space there was. The realtor told me that the previous owner had passed away, and the house had sat vacant for a few years. He assured me it was structurally sound, just in need of a little cosmetic care. For the price, it seemed like a steal. I wasn't put off by the thought of fixing it up. In fact, I looked forward to the challenge. I signed the papers and moved in within a month. It felt like a fresh start, a new beginning for me in a place where I could finally feel at peace. The first few days were spent unpacking, setting up furniture, and getting familiar with the layout of the house. It had a wide front entrance that led into a spacious living room, with a stone fireplace that immediately drew my attention. A narrow hallway connected to a kitchen in the back, and an old wooden staircase led to the second floor, where the bedrooms were. Everything seemed fine at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. It wasn't anything I could explain easily, just a sense that I was being watched. Sometimes, while unpacking in the living room, I would catch movement out of the corner of my eye, like something shifting in the shadows of the hallway. But when I turned, there was nothing there. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the adjustment to a new place. Old houses make noises, I reminded myself. It's nothing to worry about. But the noises didn't stop. At night, I would hear creaks and groans from upstairs, like someone was walking around. The first time I heard it, I froze, lying perfectly still in bed, listening intently. The sound was unmistakable, footsteps moving slowly from one side of the upstairs hallway to the other. I got out of bed, grabbed the flashlight I kept on my nightstand, and made my way upstairs. My heart was racing, but I tried to stay calm. I told myself it was probably just the house settling, or maybe an animal had gotten inside. But as I reached the top of the stairs, the footsteps stopped. I shined the light down the hallway, sweeping it from one end to the other. Nothing. The doors to the bedrooms were closed, just as I had left them. I checked each room, but everything was in its place. There was no sign of anyone or anything out of the ordinary. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening for any more sounds. When morning finally came, I tried to put the experience out of my mind. Maybe I was just on edge from the move. It had been a stressful few weeks, and my nerves were probably getting the better of me. But as the days went by, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't just at night anymore. During the day, while I was working in the yard or cleaning the house, I could feel eyes on me. Sometimes I'd turn around suddenly, expecting to catch someone there, but there was never anyone. Then the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind. The house was surrounded by trees, and when the wind picked up, it would whistle through the branches, creating eerie sounds that echoed around the property. But these whispers were different. They were soft, almost inaudible at first, like someone standing just behind me, speaking in a low voice. I'd hear them in different parts of the house, while I was cooking in the kitchen, while I was sitting in the living room, even while I was lying in bed. The whispers would come and go, never lasting more than a few seconds. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable. It was as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. One night, after another sleepless evening of hearing footsteps and whispers, I decided to do some research on the house. I hadn't thought much about its history when I first bought it, but now I needed to know if there was something more to this place. I found an old newspaper article from about 20 years ago. The previous owner, a man named Robert Wills, had lived in the house alone for decades. He was a bit of a recluse, according to the article, rarely leaving the house or speaking to neighbors. But what caught my attention was the way he had died. The article said that Robert had been found dead in the upstairs bedroom, sitting in an old wooden rocking chair by the window. There were no signs of foul play, but the strange part was that he had been sitting there for days before anyone found him. The neighbors only called the police when they noticed the mail piling up on his front porch. The house had remained empty after his death. Apparently, no one in the town had been interested in buying it, and over time it had been forgotten. Until I came along. As I read more about Robert's life, I found something even more unsettling. Before Robert had moved into the house, another family had lived there, a young couple with a child. The article didn't give many details, but it mentioned that the couple had left the house suddenly, abandoning it without explanation. The child had reportedly started hearing voices, claiming there were people in the walls. I closed my laptop, a sick feeling twisting in my stomach. Was that what was happening to me? Were the whispers I was hearing somehow connected to whatever had driven that family away? I didn't want to believe it, but the signs were hard to ignore. The footsteps, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, it all lined up too perfectly. I decided to confront whatever was in the house. I wasn't going to let it drive me out like it had with the others. That night, I sat in the living room, the lights dimmed, waiting. I knew that if something was going to happen, it would happen after dark. For hours I sat in silence, listening to the creaks of the house settling, the distant rustle of the trees outside. I could feel the tension building in the air, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. And then, just after midnight, the footsteps started again. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. They came from upstairs, moving slowly across the floorboards. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight from the coffee table and headed for the stairs. As I climbed the steps, the footsteps stopped, just like before. But this time, I wasn't going to let it end there. I reached the top of the stairs and turned to face the hallway. The door to the bedroom where Robert had died was slightly ajar. I took a deep breath and pushed it open. The room was dark, the air heavy with the scent of dust and something else I couldn't quite place. In the center of the room, facing the window, was the old rocking chair. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I had never seen that chair in any of the rooms I had unpacked. But there it was, creaking softly as it rocked back and forth, as if someone had just been sitting in it. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I stepped into the room. The air felt thick, oppressive, like it was pushing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I moved toward the chair, my flashlight flickering in the dim light. That's when I heard it, the whisper, clearer than ever before. Leave. The word was so soft, so faint, that I almost didn't hear it. But it was there, a single command spoken directly into my ear. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering wildly. The room seemed to spin around me, and the shadows in the corners of the room grew darker, closing in. I could feel a presence there, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I bolted out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the house. I didn't stop running until I reached the end of the driveway, gasping for air. I looked back at the house, its dark windows staring back at me like hollow eyes. I knew then that I couldn't stay. The house didn't want me there. Whatever was inside, whether it was the spirit of Robert Wills or something older, something darker, it had made its intentions clear. The next morning, I called the realtor and put the house back on the market. I packed my things and left that same day, leaving behind the life I thought I was going to build in that house. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. For a brief moment, I thought I saw someone standing in the upstairs window, watching me leave. I never looked back again. My name is Ethan, and I'm not the kind of guy who believes in ghosts, curses, or anything supernatural. I've always been practical, grounded in reality. But after what happened when I moved into the house on Oak Hill, I don't know what to believe anymore. It all started when I bought the house a few months ago. It was an old colonial-style home, perched on top of a small hill surrounded by oak trees. The place had a certain charm, faded white paint, ivy climbing the stone foundation, and big windows that let in plenty of light. It had been on the market for a while, and the price was more than reasonable considering how much space it offered. The realtor mentioned that the previous owner, an older man named Mr. Harding, had lived there alone for years before passing away. The house had been empty ever since, waiting for someone like me to come along. I didn't think much of it. People die in houses all the time. It's not like it meant the place was haunted or anything. When I first moved in, everything seemed perfect. The house had a cozy, lived-in feel to it, and I was excited to start making it my own. I spent the first week unpacking, getting everything set up, and exploring the nooks and crannies of the house. It was bigger than I expected, with plenty of room for all my stuff and then some. One of the first things I noticed was how quiet it was. The house sat far back from the road, and there were no neighbors for at least half a mile in either direction. At night, the only sounds were the creaking of the house settling and the occasional rustling of the wind through the oak trees outside. At first, I enjoyed the silence. It was peaceful, a nice change from the constant noise of the city. But as the days went on, the quiet started to feel less comforting and more oppressive. It was like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then the strange things started. It was small stuff at first. I'd leave a room, come back a few minutes later, and something would be out of place. A book I had set down on the coffee table would be on the floor. A cabinet door in the kitchen would be slightly open when I was sure I had closed it. I tried to brush it off as forgetfulness. Moving into a new house is stressful, I told myself. It's easy to misremember where you put things. But the more it happened, the harder it was to ignore. One night, I was lying in bed, reading, when I heard a soft thud from downstairs. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough to make me sit up and listen. I waited, straining to hear anything else, but the house had gone completely silent again. I told myself it was just the house settling, as old houses tend to do. But when I went downstairs to check, I found one of the dining chairs had been pulled away from the table, almost like someone had been sitting there and pushed it back when they stood up. A chill ran down my spine. I was sure I hadn't moved that chair. I hadn't even been in the dining room all evening. I put the chair back, feeling a little unnerved, but not ready to jump to conclusions. There had to be a logical explanation. That's when I started hearing the footsteps. They always came at night, just after I'd gotten into bed. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. But as the nights went on, they grew louder, more distinct. I could hear them moving through the house, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking from room to room, checking to see if I was asleep. I'd lie there, frozen, listening to the footsteps approach my bedroom door. They never came inside, though. They would stop just outside the door, lingering for a few moments before retreating back down the hall. I never saw anyone, but I could feel their presence. It was as if whoever or whatever was making those footsteps was waiting for the right moment to show itself. One night, I had enough. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. I grabbed the flashlight I kept by my bed and marched out of my room, determined to confront whatever was making the noise. I flipped on the lights as I went, casting harsh yellow light into the dark corners of the house. But there was no one there. The hall was empty, the other rooms dark and untouched. The footsteps had stopped the moment I left my room, and the house was as still as ever. Frustrated, I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't want to entertain. Maybe the house wasn't as empty as I thought. The next morning, I decided to do some digging into the history of the house. I hadn't paid much attention when I bought it. I was more focused on the price and the location than anything else. But now, I wanted to know more about the previous owners, especially Mr. Harding. I went to the local library and found some old newspaper articles about the house. Most of them were just mentions of neighborhood events or local news, nothing unusual. But then I found something that made my blood run cold. There was an article from about 50 years ago, detailing the death of a young girl who had lived in the house. Her name was Lily, and she had been just 7 years old when she disappeared. According to the article, Lily had been playing in the yard one afternoon when she wandered off into the woods behind the house. Her parents searched for her for days, but she was never found. A year later, her father, overcome with grief, hanged himself in the attic. The house had been sold shortly after, and it changed hands several times over the years, with each owner staying only a short time before selling it again. The article didn't mention Mr. Harding specifically, but I found another piece that said he had moved into the house about 20 years ago, shortly after his wife had passed away. He had lived there alone until his death. I sat in the library, staring at the articles in front of me, a sinking feeling in my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening in the house was connected to Lily and her father. The footsteps, the moving objects, it all seemed like the actions of someone trying to get my attention. But why? And what did they want? I didn't have any answers, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house much longer. The atmosphere had changed since I had learned about Lily. The house felt heavier, darker, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. The footsteps came more frequently now, and the whispers had started. They were faint at first, just soft murmurs in the distance, but soon they became clearer. I'd hear my name, whispered from the corners of the room when I was alone. Sometimes it sounded like a child's voice. Other times, it was deeper, almost menacing. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The house wouldn't let me. Every night the footsteps would start, followed by the whispers. And every night I felt more and more trapped, as if the house was trying to keep me there, just like it had kept Lily. I decided to leave. I didn't care if I lost money on the house, I just needed to get out. I packed a bag and planned to stay with a friend while I figured out what to do next. But the night before I was supposed to leave, something happened that I'll never forget. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., and I was lying in bed, wide awake, listening to the footsteps as usual. They were louder than ever that night, almost as if someone was stomping through the house, angry and desperate. I pulled the covers up to my chin, trying to block out the sound, but then I heard something new, a soft, high-pitched giggle. It was faint, almost childlike, and it sent a wave of dread through me. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, the giggle came again, closer this time, as if it was right outside my door. I grabbed the flashlight and stood up, my hands trembling. I didn't want to open the door, but I had to. I had to know what was out there. I swung the door open, shining the flashlight into the hallway. At first, I didn't see anything, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow move at the far end of the hall. I stepped out of my room, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The shadow was still there, barely visible in the dim light. It looked small, like the outline of a child. I moved closer, my flashlight flickering as I approached. The shadow didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching my every step. When I was only a few feet away, the shadow suddenly darted into the next room. I followed, my heart racing, but when I entered the room, it was empty, except for the rocking chair. It was sitting in the corner, just like it had been when I first moved in, but this time, it was rocking slowly back and forth, as if someone had just been sitting in it. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard a voice, soft and childlike. My name is Matt, and I never expected my life to take such a strange and terrifying turn when my wife and I moved into a house on Hollow Road. It was a quiet street, tucked away in the outskirts of a small town, and we thought it would be the perfect place to start fresh. We had been renting for years, saving up to finally buy our own place, and when we found the listing for this old Victorian-style home, it seemed like fate. The house had been on the market for a while, and the price was much lower than we expected. I remember asking the realtor if there was something wrong with it, but she shrugged and said, "Old houses take time to sell. People want new and shiny these days." It seemed reasonable enough, so we jumped at the opportunity. In no time, we were packing up our apartment and making the move. When we arrived, the house looked just as beautiful as the pictures online had shown. It sat on a large plot of land, surrounded by tall trees that swayed gently in the wind. The porch was wide, with peeling white paint and an old swing that creaked with every gust. The windows were large and round at the top, giving the house an almost eerie charm. Despite its neglected appearance, I could see the potential. My wife, Emily, loved the idea of fixing it up, making it our own. Can you believe it?" she said with a smile as we stood in front of the house. "Our very own home." I smiled back, though something about the place made me uneasy. It wasn't the house itself, but more the way it felt. The air seemed heavier here, colder. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the excitement and stress of the move. We had a lot of work ahead of us, and I couldn't afford to be worrying about silly feelings. The first few days were uneventful. We unpacked, arranged our furniture, and started settling in. Emily spent most of her time in the garden, planting flowers and trimming the overgrown bushes. I focused on fixing small things around the house, loose floorboards, stuck windows, and the like. There was always something to repair in a house this old, but I didn't mind. It kept me busy. It wasn't until the first night we spent alone in the house that things began to feel off. Emily and I had finished dinner and were sitting in the living room, watching TV. The sun had set, and the house felt unusually cold for early summer. I got up to check the thermostat, but it read a comfortable 72 degrees. Still, I couldn't shake the chill in the air. I grabbed a blanket and settled back on the couch. As the evening wore on, we began to hear strange noises coming from the upstairs. At first, it sounded like the house settling, creaks and groans from old wood adjusting to the change in temperature. But then, it became something more. Footsteps. I muted the TV and glanced at Emily. She raised an eyebrow. "Do you hear that?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "It sounds like someone's walking upstairs." I felt a knot form in my stomach. We hadn't been upstairs since we moved in. The second floor was still filled with unopened boxes and furniture we hadn't set up yet. There shouldn't have been anyone up there. I stood up, grabbed a flashlight, and headed for the stairs. Emily followed closely behind. As we climbed, the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. They weren't the random creaks of an old house. It was the sound of someone, or something, moving. When we reached the top of the stairs, the sound stopped. I shone the flashlight around, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was dark, lined with doors to the bedrooms and the bathroom. Everything was still, silent. "Maybe it was just the house settling," Emily whispered, though she didn't sound convinced. We checked every room, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone, no reason for the footsteps we'd heard. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. We went back downstairs, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching us. Over the next few days, things only got stranger. Doors would open on their own, lights would flicker, and we both started hearing whispers late at night. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable, a soft murmur in the walls. But soon, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a voice clearly say my name. "Matt." I sat up, my heart racing. Emily was asleep beside me, completely unaware. I strained to listen, but the voice didn't speak again. I lay back down, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts. Was I imagining things? Was the stress of the move getting to me? The next day, I decided to explore the house more thoroughly. There was an attic we hadn't been up to yet, and I figured it was time to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and headed up the narrow staircase that led to the attic door. The door was old, the paint chipped and faded. When I opened it, a rush of cold air hit me, colder than any other part of the house. The attic was dark, filled with old furniture and boxes covered in dust. As I stepped inside, the wooden floor creaked under my weight, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I scanned the room with my flashlight, and that's when I saw it. A small door in the far corner of the attic. It was barely noticeable, hidden behind an old wardrobe. My heart raced as I approached it. I didn't remember seeing it on the house's floor plan, and the realtor hadn't mentioned it. I hesitated for a moment, then reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about this hidden staircase felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to find it. But curiosity got the better of me. I started down the stairs, my flashlight flickering as I descended. The air grew colder the farther I went, and the walls around me seemed to close in. At the bottom of the staircase was a small, dark room. It was empty except for a single old wooden chair sitting in the center. I shone my flashlight around the room, but there was nothing else, just bare walls and that chair. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange. The floor around the chair was covered in deep scratches, as if someone or something had been dragged across it repeatedly. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel cold breath on my skin. I turned around, but there was nothing there. I bolted back up the stairs, slamming the door behind me, my heart racing. Something was very wrong with this house. I told Emily about the hidden room, but she was skeptical. She hadn't experienced the same things I had. The whispers, the cold, the feeling of being watched, none of it seemed to affect her the way it did me. She brushed it off, saying I was overreacting, that old houses had quirks, but I knew better. The whispers continued. Every night, they grew louder, more insistent. They were no longer just random murmurs, they were calling my name. And then, they started calling Emily's name too. One night, I woke up to the sound of Emily talking in her sleep. At least, that's what I thought it was at first. But as I listened, I realized she wasn't just talking, she was answering the whispers. I shook her awake, but she had no memory of it. She looked at me like I was crazy, but I knew what I'd heard. The whispers were getting to her now too. Things escalated quickly after that. The strange occurrences became more frequent. Doors slammed shut on their own, objects moved, and the whispers followed us everywhere. It was like the house was alive, and it didn't want us there. One night, I was sitting in the living room when I heard a loud crash from upstairs. I ran up to find that the door to the hidden room in the attic had been thrown open. I hadn't touched it since the day I found it, but there it was, wide open, as if something had come out. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way back up to the attic. The cold was unbearable now, and the air felt thick with something I couldn't explain. I shone the light around the room, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing in the corner, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. I froze, unable to move, as the figure slowly turned to face me. My breath caught in my throat as it whispered my name again, louder this time. Matt. I bolted down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran out of the house and didn't stop until I was standing in the middle of the yard, gasping for air. I knew without a doubt that something evil was in that house. I tried to convince Emily to leave, but she wouldn't listen. She was convinced it was all in my head, that I was just stressed. But I knew the truth. The house was haunted, and whatever was inside it wanted us gone, or worse, it wanted us to stay. The next few nights were a blur of terror. I hardly slept, afraid of what might happen if I closed my eyes. The whispers grew louder, more persistent, and the figure in the attic appeared more often. It was no longer just standing in the shadows, it was moving closer. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and told Emily we had to leave. She refused, insisting there was nothing wrong, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house another night. As I drove away, I looked back at the house one last time. The windows seemed darker than before, as if the house itself was watching me leave. I could still hear the whispers, faint but unmistakable, calling my name. I never went back to that house. Emily stayed behind, convinced I was overreacting, but I knew better. I've heard stories since then, about other people who moved in after us. None of them stayed for long. Some say the house on Hollow Road is cursed, that it's a place where the past lingers, where restless spirits roam. All I know is that I'll never forget the whispers, the cold, and the figure that watched me from the shadows. And I'll never go back.